Welcome to NAACP Akron Power and Community Podcast, a podcast that focuses on important issues and topics that affect our community here in Akron, Ohio. We believe that knowledge is power and organized power makes change happen. I am Judy Hill, President of the NAACP Akron branch.
And I'm Dr. Lothardus Goggins II, the second Vice President and Education Chair for the NAACP Akron.
Welcoming with us today, we have, I want to call you Doctor. I'm sorry, Dr. Imokhai. We will be your host as we discuss issues and strategies to make Akron a more just and better place to live, work, and play. And today we're talking about criminal justice and justice reform.
Yes, so as we've been going through this series focused on the topics from Hour 25, the National NAACP initiative, today's topic is criminal justice. And so we have a local
freedom fighter,
hero, the brother who's been taking it to him to come in and share some thoughts. And so let's start with this idea that a part of the initiative is to address systems of racism in the criminal justice system, which lead to higher incarceration rates, right? So that's one of the big things. So, but let's start with when we say criminal justice. Now, kind of what does that mean? Because that's kind of a term that's
broad, yeah.
Yeah. Well, one, I appreciate you guys having me for sure to have this conversation. When I think about criminal justice and when I talk to people about criminal justice, it's really thinking about the system in its entirety. Okay. And so you're thinking about policing, right? You're thinking about the court system. You're thinking about probation. You're thinking about the attorneys and the lawyers, right? You're thinking about the prosecutor's office, judges. And it's these individuals, actors that make up this system of justice that largely is dictated by the Supreme Court of Ohio, by the United States Supreme Court, and by legislation that comes out of the Ohio State House.
Okay, so it's not just the police, but it's the prosecutors who determine what charges.
Right.
If there's a charge that the police have arrested.
Yep.
The judges.
It's the judges who would then look at, now the charges have been brought, here's the argument that's being made in front of them, right? And then also, you said that even the lawyers, who's this whole thing. And then, if I heard you correctly, even on the backside, then the probation officers or the whole probation system.
Right. And what I didn't even touch on is the whole prison industrial complex.
So, right.
And that's a whole other situation.
Right. Yeah, well, that's a discussion there. Maybe on another day, because we can talk about if they're called correctional institutions.
Should they be correcting?
Yeah, right. What new? Right. Yes, for sure. So just give us a broad thing on the national level. You said, even the Supreme Court. Mm-hmm. What are some of the trends or issues that are going on at that national level?
So when we're thinking about the national level, right, we're thinking about how they are able to analyze your constitutional rights. And so a lot of that is thinking about Fourth Amendment, the right to search and seizure, right, the right to be able to go into your home and search your home, the right to be able to search you in your car, right? They're largely the referees dictating what the Constitution is supposed to mean and as it's applied to individual situations. And so, as a criminal defense attorney, if I believe my client's rights have been violated, I'm going to be putting in motions to either exclude evidence, motions to dismiss the case because my client's rights have been violated. And then it's up to the judges to determine whether my arguments make sense as applied to the Constitution. And the highest level of those courts is the U.S. Supreme Court. Mm-hmm. And the U.S. Supreme Court has, for decades now, it feels like centuries, have been putting out case law that dictates what your rights are as an individual, right? And how they interpret the Constitution to decide whether your rights are violated or not violated in the criminal context in your relation to dealing with the police. And so largely that is what's happening from the Supreme Court, is giving analysis about your constitutional rights, how they should be applied to your individual criminal cases.
I find that interesting when you consider the fact that a black person is 5 times more likely to be arrested or stopped by police and arrested and convicted. But yet, if we look at the law, how in the world can we justify that we are that, and we're not even the majority population.
Yeah, that's just ridiculous, right? Because they want you to imagine this picture of Lady Justice, right? This idea that she has a blindfold over her eyes and that she's just giving out justice in relation to this law that should be, race neutral. But the problem with that is it ignores a country that was birthed out of racial bias, right? And so that racial bias is still at play through the individual actors and through these systems of justice, right? There's a reason why more black people are coming through the criminal justice system, because black neighborhoods are being policed more than other neighborhoods, right? Black people find themselves more likely to be interacting with police, black folks, poor folks, other people of color, right? Individuals who don't find themselves in the hierarchy of capitalism, right? Those individuals find themselves interacting with the police more often, find themselves in the courts more often, and find themselves incarcerated more often. And largely it's because these laws as applied are very broad. These laws want to be very broad as applied to individuals and say the littlest things can be able to put you in jail, right? You disciplining your child at home, right, can land you with a domestic violence conviction or can land you with a child abuse conviction, even though we've been doing corporal punishment in this country for I don't know how long, right? So now it's somewhat a crime to whoop your children, because if I see a black mother, right, I might look at her differently through a different lens of racial bias because of what has been portrayed about black women versus looking at a white mother and how she might discipline her children, and I might think, oh, that was just discipline, but oh, this somehow is abuse, right?
And the language is different when they report it too.
You're right.
That's what drives me crazy when I listen on TV or even on the news, reading some of the articles. It always sounds like we are the bad guy. Always.
It's the
we are
story they
always
tell.
the one.
Right,
Yeah.
if remembering Tamir Rice when it first came out, he was 18, 19, 6 foot, that kind of thing.
Right.
And he's like, nah, he's a boy.
Right.
You gave him 2 seconds, right? But that whole adultification
Yes.
of black children, both male and female, that we expect them, we look at them to be older than what they actually are, bigger than what they actually are, and assume the aggression and negative things.
Inherently dangerous.
yes.
Inherently, right?
Yeah.
And I know I'm going to step on you, because my son, my middle son, 6 foot,
Right.
2, big boy, but he's a big teddy bear,
Yeah.
right? I know you got a grandson,
That's right. 6'1".
big boy,
Yeah.
but this is a cool kid. And if he was out playing, not knowing necessarily the situation, or because he's young, just being a kid.
Not knowing the social norms of that situation where he is right then and there, because that makes a difference.
Right.
Right.
But you come up on him and you just see big black and assume, right? So that thing in his hand looks more like, it just can't be a toy.
Can't possibly be a cell phone.
Or right. Isn't that kind of, that's a, that's good. So the myth of blind justice becomes a thing, right? But I find it interesting because we are in a moment where what we think is settled constitutional perspectives are being challenged. That even the things like, may I search you? Technically, you could say no, right? Because if you don't have reason, so now you got to ask. But if I say no, that becomes a problem. But how do we deal with
it's tough. I think so much of it is trying to understand systems and then better understanding how to navigate those systems. And so much of the problem is that we're not putting out real information to our communities to really understand the law, to really understand how what your laws and rights are with regard to police interactions. But then also giving the real context is that you might have these rights, but you're also dealing with a situation that you have a disadvantage in power. And how power plays into a situation when you're facing a police officer who very well can violate your rights because they have a badge on their hip, they have a gun on their hip, and they have more power than you in that situation. And you're expected to acquiesce to that power if you want to live, right? If you want to be safe for your life and be able to argue it on the back end. You're supposed to have enough grace, or you're supposed to have enough, self-control to argue it on the back end when you go to court after you've been arrested, after you may have been harmed, right? After you dealt with the trauma of being snatched up from your community like an animal and put into a cage like an animal, brought to court that next morning like an animal, and maybe released. And you're supposed to somehow, deal with that. And so often it's like, where I find myself is trying to explain to people, what your rights are. I often tell people, it might not always be the most comfortable. It doesn't always feel right. But I always tell people, always comply, but never consent. Comply with the orders that you might be given. Go ahead and step out the car, because unfortunately, if a cop asks you to step out the car, you got to step out of the car. Go ahead and give them your ID. It's not a big deal. Let them have your ID. Let them run the information. But if they ask to search that car, the answer is no. If they ask you to search you, the answer is no. Right? And so there's ways in which you can try to navigate the situation to keep yourself safe, because at the end of the day, your humanity is important. But you have to also recognize the power dynamics, and it's hard to sometimes let the lawyer try to do the argue on the back end. But if that makes the difference between you living and not, I'd rather you do that.
Right.
I remember another situation where I called you about a situation in a school, and we were talking about rights, and you said, well, in a school setting, their rights are different.
Oh yeah.
They give up. You no longer have any rights because it has been given to the school system. That kind of bothered me, but I understand it as an educator to a degree.
Right, and that's all coming from case law, right? Because those are all decisions by the United States Supreme Court or our state Supreme Court that say, in this context, your First Amendment rights are not the same. In the schooling context, right? In this context of the Fourth Amendment, because you are in school, because of those conditions, your rights are not the same. And that's just judges interpreting the Constitution. And that becomes then what we call case law. And that is the law that really is the law of the land, is that case law, because the statutes you read are intended to be broad. They're broad to allow for a lot of discretion in the situation, right? And what those words ultimately mean in that statute, us lawyers always argue about, but it's a judge that determines what those words then mean, and that becomes case law. And that's why, the Republicans, the conservative folks are putting in new judges, because they want these new judges to determine new case law, to interpret the law differently that changes the dynamic. So, we might have a situation in which you have birthplace, citizenship in this country, right? We've made that clear, right? We said the Constitution is clear on this issue. But if you have some very conservative Supreme Court justices that say, oh, actually, I now interpret that differently. We don't actually have that birthplace citizenship. And we're going to make a new sort of standard. We're going to interpret this differently, which becomes case law, which becomes everything that every judge lower than us has to now apply.
Well, just to put a quick plug in, that's why voting matters.
That's why voting matters,
Even in the off quote unquote years, because it is often these judges, the prosecutor, the DA, the police chief, if you're in those kind of situations, but definitely the mayor, your council person, who are making these type of decisions about who will run the police department or who will be here, have greater influence on how those laws, statutes get interpreted than who's going to be the president, right? I want to go back to so much that was there, but even this notion, because what reminded me of when you started talking was, and it was kind of a thing a couple years ago, but it resurfaced. But having that talk, having particularly with the black boy, about here's what you do, right? And I've told my sons, your first job is to survive. Get home, then come tell it. I will get some fun. I'm going to give some people some calls.
There you go.
And we go fight it.
Right.
But your tail gets home.
Yeah.
Pay attention. Be smart. So having that discussion. But it sounds like even with the community, because sometimes that nuance of, I think I got this, or we was talking beforehand, on Law and Order, dun dun.
Right.
It was like boom, boom, boom.
Right.
I can do this.
Right.
And you're like, nah, not quite.
Not quite. Not
See,
quite.
we have to balance the reality with what, and then our young people think that they have a voice. We have trained them to have a voice.
And that's tough too, because I tell people, it sucks because it requires a lot of self-restraint and self-control. I tell folks, like, if you like to argue, know that cops like to argue too.
Right.
and they better at arguing
Right.
sometimes, and they have more power in those situations, right? If you like to yell, they like to yell too. If you like to cuss, they like to cuss right back at you too. And so
That's right.
you have to try to figure out how to navigate the situation under the circumstances based off what you care about. Right. And I can't be the person to decide for you what it is that you care about, but I can certainly try to give you enough information to know what you might expect given certain behavior.
Sure.
And so it's just all about the individual trying to figure out how to survive. Right. And we've been having this problem for centuries, right? On how to survive with this power dynamic, right? From it being slave patrols to now being police officers, right? We've always been trying to navigate how to survive these situations and stay safe, and also how to stay sane after harm happens,
After
right?
it happened.
And we're seeing that now down in Cincinnati. Right? What happened with Andre Hinton. And it's just like, a lot of people want to respond a certain way. Some people are on both sides of the fence, right? You're wrong for what you did. You're right for what you did, And it's such a impossible situation to think about.
Yeah.
But we weren't that divided on the issue when it regarded, Luigi Mangione. Right, with the individual who unalived the head of the insurance company, right? Because we felt that there was a moral reason as to why he did that, right? He was morally justified for potentially doing that, right? GoFundMe didn't stop his GoFundMe to raise his money,
Absolutely
right? But somehow in the policing context, in the context of racism, in the context of police violence in this country, somehow that there's a difference.
Yeah.
Somehow. Right.
And there are parents who feel that they can navigate this situation themselves by, I'm going to send my children to the right school. I'm going to have them interact with the right people. And even in that interaction, you're still a black boy riding with those white folks. And when you get stopped, you're still going to be treated that way.
And it's tough because, I imagine, right, you saw the press conference with the law firm and when Andre Hinton before, the incident happened where he was at that press conference. And, how many of those press conferences have we seen? How many of those press conferences have you been at?
That's
right.
Mm-hmm.
And we're expected to tell individuals that we can fight for you to get some justice here. We can fight for you for this situation to be different. And time again, it resolves in not being different.
Right.
Just here in the city of Akron, 8 officers murdered Jalen Walker, and they're still on the streets. I got another call from another one of those officers who's out here still on some BS, right? And, there's countless times in which police are not held accountable, and we're expected to just be like, hey, that's the process.
Right.
That's our systems of justice, right? It's, the prosecutors obviously didn't do what they need to do. The jury somehow came up with this decision, or this judge made this decision, and it just becomes frustrating. And how do you explain that to a father? And it's just like, how else do you get justice?
Right. How do you trust this thing that doesn't time and time again
you correctly?
You've seen the
like
evidence
a human.
of right.
Yeah. And it's just like, I feel so bad sometimes because it's just like, I don't have any other, solution. We haven't necessarily built the institutions needed to hold accountability different today, right? Because we always go to these protests, who keeps us safe? We keep us safe. But we haven't built the institutions that really allow for us to keep us safe. We built great institutions, and they're working, and the organizing is happening, and it's happening every day, but it requires more people to get involved, right? Because it's these institutions and people getting involved that allow us to build institutions, systems that truly keep us safe and allow us to get justice and accountability.
Well, let's
that's what I loved about the Black Panther movement. I'm sorry. That's how I really got involved in social justice, because their whole premise was about we keep us safe, right? They protected their neighborhood. They fed their neighborhood. They were very smart, educated folk who still were targeted by the police, were targeted by law enforcement, by the system itself.
The most powerful 3-letter organizations that in countries.
But we're talking about doctorates. We're talking about very highly educated individuals who tried to take control of their neighborhood and keep them safe. And I believe in that. I really do. I believe we can do it. It's just that we don't have the systems to absolutely encourage us to do it. And then we don't have the complete buy-in.
Well,
it's the conditions, right? And I don't blame people, right? It's so much of these conditions that folks are suffering through, are struggling through. And the more that we can address those conditions, which is why the Black Panthers were so successful, right? They believe in these ideas of survival programs, that if I can feed you, that if I can educate you, that I can provide you health care, that I can put clothes in your back, we can create the conditions that don't have you in survival mode and can look at these situations for the clarity. You can see the contradictions. And those contradictions alone will radicalize you enough. The conditions and what is happening to you will radicalize you enough, and the truth is the truth, right? And you will begin to build your own program. You will begin to organize and begin to change the situation that you find yourself in.
Well, and when we had a discussion with the young people either last year or the year before, one of the things that we asked them was, here's the Black Panthers 10-point program.
Right.
What would be your program if you had the opportunity? What would be the point that you would have if you could talk to somebody in power? And on that list was police reform. On that list was social justice reform or court reform. And our young people are seeing this, right? They're dealing with it. But let's go back to, you said getting people involved, right? So what are some things that as a person, I hear in this, I'm like, hey, something needs to happen. What are some things that we could be doing, should be doing?
One, I think there's the education piece, right? There's beginning to understand the systems, to understand what is happening, to begin to think about actual alternatives, to get creative about what is possible. It's the creativity element that's a lot of times sometimes missing from our community because we don't necessarily know. We've been limited. We've been kind of put into a box and don't really understand what is actually happening within these systems. And so I think going and finding ways to be able to educate yourself through experience or through organizations and programs who are doing educational efforts like the NAACP, like the Freedom Block with Block University, right? Getting tapped in with individuals to get a better understanding of what's going on. I think also is getting involved wherever you kind of see fit, right? Figuring out what it is that you care about and finding organizations and finding people doing work on the ground. Whether it's, you're passionate about healthcare, go get involved with organizations who are trying to redesign or reconfigure the healthcare system, right? And how they can begin to provide healthcare to individuals, right? I strongly encourage people to get involved in the work of like what we call survival programs, what we call providing for people's basic needs, because it is through that you are really connected with more people to begin to really develop an analysis about what's going on, to figure out what needs to happen to change it. Because at the same time, you're able to provide for that need, but then be creative and figure out and organize and build power necessary to start changing what is going on, right? It is because the Black Panthers started feeding kids that we had breakfast programs for free now. It's because the Panthers started providing free groceries that we now have WIC, right? And so it's like trying to figure out what it is that you can do to be an asset to your neighbor and be a menace to your enemies is really what is necessary for people. And a lot of that is trying to discover who you are, right? And who you are, and find yourself in the history and the lineage of your people, of your ancestors, and being connected with that to be able to understand how you find yourself today in modern times, and then really getting connected with a skill or trade or something that allows you to use your hands, that allows you to use your mind, that allows you to get creative and really be an asset. And then from there, figuring out like what is possible. I always tell folks, you just got to start kind of getting busy. Right? You're not going to be able to think your way to a solution. You're not going to be able to think your way out of this situation. It is by doing that you begin to explore more, get a better understanding, and can find the creativity necessary to find that right solution. We've been doing this food program, right? It is, that food program has changed so much of my perspective on how we begin to solve problems in our community. And it is from doing, right? This idea that we're building now a free grocery store in our community and working towards that, right? That's not something that I just sat around and thought about, or someone on our team just sat around and thought about. It's through doing tenant organizing work where tenants were like, we want more for our community. We want a free store in our community. We want to be able to provide these things to our community for free. And one thing we know we could do was provide free food. And what does that look like for us to be able to build an institution that can provide free food, that can challenge all these grocery prices and allow people to actually have healthy groceries, have access to free food, and change how they think, right? There's just so many ways that folks can be inspired, be encouraged, but you got to start by just doing something. And it doesn't always have that instant gratification. That's where innovation occurs. Right, innovation.
It comes from the doing, because you're looking for solutions in a way that can help everyone. It reminds me of our program that we've been trying to get off the ground. That's what we want young people to do. Not only do we want to tell you or show you, we want to listen, tell you, but then get you out there so that you can help be that next change maker.
The Funkadugs always said, right, free your mind and your ass will follow. Right? And that is a bar. That is so true. Like the more you begin to develop a different perspective on where you find yourself, the more you can really begin to take action on what it is that you really, really care about.
Right.
Because there's not one thing that's going to get us free tomorrow. It is
Never.
consistent action, right? It is folks getting involved and tapped in with one another, building real community. We got a lot of people who live in proximity, but don't really know their neighbors, don't really know community.
Right.
And it's through community that creativity comes,
Yes.
that power is built, that programs are developed, and that people are freed.
Yeah.
And safe, right? So I want to tie that
And
in,
safe.
right? Because you keep on going back to that, those programs, those activities that get people out of survival mode.
Yes.
Right? So they can be creative, so they can make connection, they can be trusting of their neighbors, ultimately produce a community that is well, safe, and that you're less likely to have to be fearful or encounter someone who's trying to take something from you, right? So even though we're talking about being creative and feeding people or having a health care clinic or any number of things, all of this stuff intersects in a way that supports everything else.
Yes.
So that if I'm less hungry and I know where I can get sustainable food, that produces a more safe community.
Absolutely.
The better that my mother can walk down the street in comfort and knowing that without a fear, right? That the more likely that you have intergenerational conversations and all that kind of stuff that we know are so important, but out of this idea of just find a place to work, connect and organize, and it frees you. You can be more authentic in yourself, but it also creates a community in which policing becomes, right? Who's it? Menaloma Samuel talks about looking at traditional values in indigenous cultures. He says, where you find doors and locks, you find a sick community, right? It's indication of a mistrust. Where you find open doors and those kinds of things, you find a community where trust is at the center, and you tend not to find police, because if something goes down, the community is going to deal with it. Right.
But it also goes back to what you said about that the effects of some of the issues that people have faced with policing. Getting involved is one way of helping to heal. Getting involved is a way to say, yes, I can make a difference. I don't have to be a victim.
Right.
I can help change the narrative. And I really think that that's another piece of the puzzle that we don't talk enough about, because there are some children, some young folks who have been traumatized, and adults, because of their interactions in our criminal justice system. I get calls, all the time, where people are saying things, and I'm like, I can't dispute it. I can't dispute it. And it's almost like you want to say, you can't make this shit up. You can't. You can't.
And it's so much of it is hidden too, because it doesn't really hit folks until they find themselves involved in it. People don't know what's going on in that courthouse downtown unless you or a family member is involved in that, right? And the more that people just go down, I encourage people, go down and watch. These are open public hearings. Watch how these judges are treating folks, and watch the decisions that they are making, right? Watch how the court staff is treating folks, right? And it's not to say that there are just, terrible people downtown. There are wonderful people downtown who are trying to do good work, trying to navigate these systems, but sometimes it's bigger than the individual. It's the systems and the conditions that have been created. It is the law that has been placed down that you can't make a decision off of, right? That you can't vary from a decision that has already been made that is above you, right? And you're just now dealing with the conditions as they have already been laid out.
I really think that's a great idea for our young people too, to just go. We go as a group and just sit in the back. I'll never forget the first 2 times I went to court. They're like, why are you here?
Right.
I was like, why
Is this
am I
not
here? I thought it was open. Oh, we just wondered, are you here for a case, or I'm here? I just want to be present. Now, why I was there, really, who I was there for, didn't matter. I wanted to see the process. So for myself, not what the person was sharing, see it for myself. So I value that. That's another opportunity.
And not too long ago, we at one of our meetings, we'd also talk about the idea of, as a citizen, you can request a ride along.
That's right.
With the police, which is a whole nother discussion, but it's a thing, right? So, but we have to find a ways to get involved.
Right.
We have to have our presence known, and if we're not watching, right?
And
Yeah.
ride-alongs are very informative.
They do. They provide. I do believe ride-alongs provide a perspective. I've done a couple of ride-alongs that have been helpful, not necessarily in Akron, but in other communities, and they do offer a perspective. It allows you to see it from a different lens. I'm not
Yeah.
sure it's the most accurate lens because they know that it's different when police know they're being watched, right? Which is kind of why they do some actions in some places and not others. But yeah.
Yes,
totally.
but some of them are very comfortable in their environment.
Yeah.
And they
truly.
continue to show you who they really are.
I think they're untouchable.
Oh, Imokhai, thank you for coming in. I tell you, we've got to come back and do some more, right?
Oh, yeah.
It's just so much fun.
Especially, right, when you talk about us making sure that our young people understand in a different kind of way. So thank you for joining us for this essential conversation of criminal justice. As we've discussed today, real justice means fairness, transparency, and a system that protects, not just punishes, communities. Reform doesn't just happen on the police beat or in courtrooms. It begins in conversations like these, with people asking questions and holding not just each other, but elected officials accountable. Dr. Goggins?
Yes, and I'm Dr. Goggins. Over the first 6 episodes, we tackled civil rights, health equity, economic justice, education, environmental justice, and criminal justice. These aren't isolated issues. They are deeply connected, and together they shape the future of Akron. As we close out this first season of the NAACP Power and Community Podcast, we want to thank you for listening, learning, and growing with us.
But we're not done. Starting next month, we'll be back with a new monthly podcast format. Each episode will recap the key takeaways from our NAACP Akron Journal meetings and take a deeper dive into one of our standing committees or ongoing initiatives, keeping you informed, engaged, and empowered. Because knowledge is power, and organized power makes the change happen. Stay tuned, stay involved, stay connected as we continue working to make Akron a more just, equitable, and vibrant place for all of us.
All right.